Thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be here and to talk about a topic that I'm super excited about, the multiple sclerosis prodrome. So, I'm coming here from Vancouver, no commercial disclosures, but of course I would like to thank my funding bodies. A lot of the work I'm going to show you is funded by MS Canada and the US National MS Society. So, I think it's always interesting to reflect, is there an MS prodrome? And if you look at the historical literature, which McAlpine's MS, this particular book, was in press through until 2000, so not that old, and essentially it was largely dismissed from the literature. MS doesn't have a prodrome. There was no evidence cited for this statement, by the way, so I guess expertise, belief, dictated this sentence here, which is a real shame because if you look at other neurological conditions, say, such as Parkinson's disease, they were already talking about the concept of a prodrome. That was back in the early 80s. So where are we at the moment in terms of multiple sclerosis? This is often a timeline that you may see depicted for MS, although I'm gratified to see this is starting to change now. But if you look carefully, there's no mention, no explicit mention of a prodromal phase. So you're moving from, my eyesight's terrible, I can't even read the slides from here, but you're essentially moving from the risk phase through to a preclinical phase, and then boom, classical onset of MS, and so it moves on. So where do I think the prodromal phase fits? I'm saying here, and this is exactly how it's depicted in Parkinson's disease. And of course, I'm hoping by the end of this session that you'll answer yes to this question, but there's a lot here we don't understand. And we don't really fully understand how long it lasts, and we're still trying to unpack all the different signs and symptoms and features of the prodrome. So I'm just going to share with you some of the work that I've been involved with and others. So this is my overview. It's going to give you a very high-level insight into where we are in terms of the prodrome. I wanted to make this presentation accessible to as many people as possible. So my first question will be, is there multiple sclerosis prodrome and measurable using our healthcare data? What is the duration and potential features of the MS prodrome? How does MS fare against other autoimmune conditions? And is there evidence of neuroaxonal damage in the prodromal period? And then I'm going to finish up with a few summary and implication slides. So I'm going to start with our first paper we published actually in Lancet Neurology 2017. Is there an MS prodrome? This is the first question we wanted to answer. And is it measurable using our healthcare data? We needed to go in and try and objectively measure this potential prodromal phase, given that it wasn't thought to exist. And actually, it was quite challenging to get funding for this study because we were told that we wouldn't find anything, so what was the point in looking? So, cut to the chase, we did find that healthcare use was higher in the 5 years before MS onset, or we define this as a first demyelinating event using ICD codes, International Classification of Disease, and we could do that in a population-based cohort across 4 Canadian provinces, so just shy of 15,000 MS cases and 72,000 matched controls. And if you can imagine, we had a smaller group of individuals who'd been to an MS clinic, and we actually had the date of MS symptom onset as determined by the neurologist. And we also did this work in that smaller cohort as well. What I'm showing you here are the findings from the larger population-based cohort in our 4 Canadian provinces. And I've broken it down by hospitalizations at the top. In the middle, you've got physician visits, and the bottom, you've got prescriptions filled at an outpatient or community pharmacy. So just focus on that top figure for the moment. If you can imagine, on the far right-hand side is MS onset, or here it's a first demyelinating event using our ICD codes. And I'm showing you each of the 5 years leading up to MS onset. Anything above that red line is indicating that the rates of, here it's hospitalizations, were higher for individuals who went on to develop MS relative to matched controls. So it was elevated, those rates were elevated in each of those 5 years, but can you see how it really starts to kick up in the last year or two before MS onset? Now switch down to that middle figure. This is visits to physicians, and can you see a similar picture there, how it really starts to rise? And finally, a somewhat similar picture for prescription filled outpatient and community pharmacies. So just to give you a flavour of the numbers, so for hospitalisation, 78% higher rate of hospitalisations in that last year before MS onset, 88% higher rate of physician service use. Don't worry, I have got an optician's appointment next week. 49% relative increase in prescription numbers or drug classes dispensed. So, of course, we were super excited that we could actually measure something here. But, of course, it does beg the question, why? Why were these people accessing the health system more often than you would expect? So, of course, this is now our next question. So, or put it another way, what are the potential features of the MS prodrome? And, of course, we only looked explicitly at these 5 years. And so what else do we know about the potential duration of the prodrome? So there's a lot going on here, and forgive me for putting this into pictorial form, but I think it speaks to the complexity of the MS prodrome and prodromal phases in a lot of conditions, right? But in the 5 years leading up to MS onset or first demyelinating event, for our MS cases relative to matched general population controls, we found more visits to psychiatrists, more visits to physicians that resulted in a diagnosis of depression or anxiety, more irritable bowel syndrome, visits to urologists, pain, fibromyalgia, headache, migraine, sleep disturbances, and more visits to dermatologists. I'm excited, Dr. Annabelle Shirkhoff's in the audience, and he's just published a few weeks ago in Neurology, digging more into the psychiatric components of the MS prodrome. But to put it out there, it's a huge range of issues, right? And clearly none of these features are specific to MS. They're quite common in the general population as well. We're just finding that they're more common in our individuals who developed MS relative to those who didn't. So what else is out there? I think it's really nice that there are similar findings from a UK study where they explicitly accessed GP records, general practitioners, and they observed similar findings to us, which was really nice, up to 10 years before a first record of MS. They use read codes in the UK, which is slightly different to Canada. 10,000 MS cases, just shy of 40,000 matched controls. And of course, we try to delve into this further now, doing with an international collaboration between Canada and Sweden. And just to give you a flavour of some of our initial findings, presented at ECTRIMS in Milan last month, we're finding, for example, higher rates of physician visits seem to be most evident for our MS cases around 5 to 10 years before MS onset. So we're doing this now in just over 45,000 MS cases and just shy of 200,000 matched controls. So watch this space. I'm hoping that we can share some more findings on that soon. So, of course, the strength of these studies is that they're population-based, there's no volunteer bias, real-time data capture, so it virtually eliminates recall bias, which is really nice when you're trying to show something exists when previously it wasn't thought to. In Canada, we could access all of our hospital, physician, and prescription drug data. And I know I didn't show you these findings in the interest of time, but we did access a smaller group of individuals, and we could look at who'd been to an MS clinic. We could look at the years before MS symptom onset as determined by the neurologist, and we see a similar pattern as to the findings I just showed you. So, of course, limitations, though. You're not going to get access to things like lifestyle factors, exercise, smoking, and so on and so forth. And you're not going to capture subtle signs and symptoms and issues that do not prompt access to the health system. So we're probably just touching the surface of what's actually going on. So what else do we know about what's going on? Lower cognitive performance is measurable up to 2 years before MS symptom onset relative to age-matched controls. This is a really nice study. So if, equivalent here to a 6 IQ point difference and a very nice study, a nested case control study based in Norway. So these individuals around 18, 19 years of age, they were all male, who entered the compulsory at that time military system. So just over 900 MS cases and just shy of 20,000 matched controls. And I thought it was quite interesting. They broke it down for disease course. I know we're starting to move away from that kind of framework, but I think these findings are interesting anyway. So they've found evidence that individuals who went on to develop primary progressive MS, cognitive performance may be measurable, a hit in their cognitive performance may be measurable up to 20 years before MS symptom onset. So on the far right is MS symptom onset, and I'm showing you 10, 20, 30 years before. You can see the numbers start to get pretty small, but there is suggestion here that cognitive decline, while is measurable during the prodrome, and in some individuals, here it was people who were developed primary progressive MS, could start decades before apparent progressive symptoms. So strengths, cognitive metrics were collected before MS symptom onset. That's really difficult to do, so kudos to them for accessing that data set. Cases and controls were secured or nested from well-defined population, which really minimises selection bias. Of course, it's a special cohort. These are male conscript service personnel. Love to know if it's generalisable to the wider population. So how does MS fare against other immune-mediated conditions, and what do we know about neuroaxonal damage in the prodromal period? So work I was not involved with, but Dr. Ruth Ann Mary and colleagues put this nice paper out. Psychiatric disorders were common, they found, before diagnosis across immune-mediated inflammatory conditions. They combined MS, inflammatory bowel disease, rheumatoid arthritis. So if you could imagine, the middle of this figure here is anchoring you at diagnosis. So look on the far left-hand side, and you can see the years leading up to the diagnosis of one of these conditions and matched population controls in the line underneath. And you can see again how that starts to kick up in the year before diagnosis, in the years before diagnosis. So they published this as incident rate ratios, and they observed psychiatric disorders were more common in the 5 years before one of these conditions and up to 10 years, which probably really starts to speak to the prodromal period. Of course, they broke it down for each of these conditions, and it was a similar pattern for MS and IBD and rheumatoid arthritis. So evidence here of shared prodromal features across diseases. So I think that really emphasizes a need for a multifaceted approach when we're thinking about trying to identify the MS prodrome. No single feature to date is likely, obviously, specific to MS. So is there evidence of neuroaxonal damage during the prodromal period? Well, serum neurofilament light levels were elevated up to 6 years before MS onset relative to age, sex, race match controls. So another nested case control study, US military personnel, Department of Defense Serum Repository. Small study, but very well conducted, I felt. 30 MS cases, 30 controls. Majority, as you'd expect, were male and white. On the far left-hand side, I'm showing you the 6 years before MS symptom onset, with the MS cases in red and the controls in blue, and on the right-hand side, the year up before MS symptom onset, and you can see how they differ in both of those time periods. Sorry, 6 years was on the left. So it suggests that neuroaxonal damage presents even in the prodromal period. So strengths. Serum samples were collected before MS symptom onset. Cases and controls were sourced from or nested within the same well-defined population. I think really minimizing the selection bias, which is nice. It's a small study. It's a special cohort, predominantly males. Is it generalizable to other populations? We'd love to know. So I have 3 summary slides and implications. So my first question I shared with you was, is there an MS prodrome measurable using our healthcare data? And I would say yes. Currently, it seems most evident in the 5 to 10 years before clinical recognition of MS. Myriad of features here. None of them are specific to MS. Lower cognitive performance is measurable at least 2 years before MS symptom onset, and possibly longer in some individuals. There's evidence for shared features with other immune-mediated diseases, and here the psychiatric component I shared with you. And there's evidence of neuroaxonal damage with these neurofilament light levels, serum neurofilament light levels, elevated up to 6 years before MS symptom onset. So where does this word prodrome come from? It's a Greek from running before, and I think it's an interesting process or thought process to think, well, if these individuals are on this path, can we nudge them away from this path? So in case you're also wondering, well, what are the implications? Like, what are you going to do with this information? So first up, has huge implications when you're thinking about trying to prevent MS. So bear in mind that if you want to know what causes multiple sclerosis, you need to be very careful or mindful of this potential prodromal phase. You do not want to inadvertently think that someone in the prodromal phase, that feature, whatever it is causing multiple sclerosis. I have an interesting example on related to pregnancy, which looks like I've got time to briefly share. We found, for example, that particularly in the year or two before MS onset, women were having fewer pregnancies and were more likely to fill a prescription for an oral contraceptive. I'm interpreting that information, combined with everything else going on, that women who are experiencing these subtle signs and symptoms, or not so subtle, these psychiatric aspects and so on and so forth, are actually making behavioral changes and having fewer pregnancies, filling prescriptions for oral contraceptives to delay or prevent that particular pregnancy. Whereas others in the field have sometimes interpreted that information to say that that's causative of MS. And I think we really need to think carefully when we look at those kind of factors and be mindful that that may not be the case. I'm showing you here, this EBV paper, which you're going to hear about tomorrow, Science in 2022. And I thought it was nice because they explicitly factored in the potential prodromal period and show that EBV exposure or elevation in antibodies occurred before this potential prodromal period. So, of course, long-term lofty goal here is, could we actually recognize people with MS earlier? Does it provide opportunity for disability prevention? Could it alleviate uncertainty in people going through this diagnostic journey and decrease these delays in diagnosis that some people still get? Could it enable prompt management of MS, disease-modifying therapy use? Could we identify people in the prodromal phase of MS and maybe offer ethical enrollment in a neuroprotective randomized controlled trial if you had a drug of interest, perhaps similar to what's going on, say, in radiologically isolated syndrome? Of course, it's a trade-off, right? So we all want great prompt recognition and diagnosis of MS, and the caveat is here you want to prevent over or misdiagnosis of MS, which is an issue in the field. So just giving the example of back to Parkinson's disease again, where are they today? So they actually now have validated research criteria to identify people in the prodromal phase of Parkinson's disease. So what they can do is it creates a percentage certainty that individual is in the prodromal phase of Parkinson's disease. Their most recent criteria is from 2019. So it's intended for research purposes. They regularly update this as new information is available. So just to give you an example, their most recent criteria includes, for example, prodromal features of Parkinson's disease along with some imaging metrics, but they also combine that, as you can imagine, with risk markers, so sex, age and environmental exposures, physical activity and family history, and that all adds up to give you a score. So, of course, how have they used this and what are the implications then for MS? They're using it to design neuroprotective drug trials aimed at delaying progression in Parkinson's disease. Final slide. Just to leave you with a pictorial here of opportunities for MS prevention and a timeline. So on the far left-hand side, you've got risk factors for MS. Someone's born. You've got opportunity here for prevention of MS. At some point, the disease starts. And on the far right-hand side, you've got opportunity to prevent disability progression or delay. Some individuals may be picked up with having radiologically isolated syndromes. Some individuals may go on to develop this prodromal phase, make lifestyle changes, and boom, you've got classical onset of MS, and the person then will be diagnosed with MS. So I have many, many people to thank. So sorry to clutter my last slide with a bazillion names, but just to say big shout out to all my collaborators. Many of them are in the room. I've tried to highlight people from my group whose work I've shared with you, thanks to my funding bodies. And of course, I can't leave you without showing you a picture of fabulous British Columbia, halfway between Vancouver and Whistler. Give me a shout if you want to come hiking. Thank you very much.